It is time for September Patreon birthday shoutouts. It is the month of the sapphire, and as a parent and having my beautiful mother's necklace with all the birthstones, I really should have had a sapphire in there. I had 3 of my children due in September. 3 of them. Do I have a sapphire on my necklace? I do not. I have 2 paradots and 1 opal because my babies decided to come a little early and a little late. So for all of the people who actually came into this world in September, I want to say a very happy birthday to Samuel, Gabrielle, Anne-Marie, Luca, Lori, Christy, Betsy, Rosemary, Kristen, Luann, Dawn, Kelly, Isha, and Cassandra. I'm wishing you a happy birthday full of cake and sapphires. Bob and Kay Swartz adopted 3 older children, hoping that love and boundaries would be enough to heal their trauma. But as behaviors escalated, their ability to cope diminished, and it led to tragic results. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crime Lines. Welcome to Crime Lines. This is going to be another long episode, and I want to thank Laura for recommending it. A major source for this was the book Sudden Fury by Leslie Walker, and even my archival news research into this included a lot of Leslie Walker's articles. The book appears to be out of print, but you can get used copies, which is what I did. When Laura sent this case over, it went onto my suggestion list, like all of the other suggestions you all send me, and I started doing some basic overview research to see if it was a good fit for the show. The more I read about this case, the more uncomfortable it made me. And I'm someone who bought fully into that whole sit with that method of dealing with things that make me uncomfortable, and so I did, and that's why I'm covering it. To give just a little bit more context about this case, as you know, I am going to the launch party for Studio Both And, which is owned by Josh Hallmark from True Crime BS. I'm doing a live show with Justin from Generation Y, Amanda from Wine and Crime, and Nina from Already Gone, so ticket info is in the show notes, but that's not the context. The context is the name of the studio, Both And. This is a phrase that Josh uses a lot, even in regular conversations when he's asked a this or that question. One time he used it recently was at the True Crime Podcast Festival. Josh and I did a presentation on how he and his team rule in and out potential Keys victims. During the question and answer portion, someone asked about Israel Keys as a father. Was he a good father or a bad one? And Josh's response was both, and here's the fuller context that tells us that things are not always black or white. They're not always 100% true or 100% false. These 2 opposing ideas can exist, like Israel Keys being both a good and a bad father, but they exist in different contexts, different times, or different places. This is a case where both victims and perpetrator occupy the space of both and I think you'll understand what I mean as we get to the end of the episode. But we need to get started first, and we are starting with Catherine and Bob Swartz. Catherine, who was known as Katie, Kate, and then later Kay at different points in her life, grew up in Iowa and graduated high school at the top of her class. She then attended college locally to become a high school language teacher, both studying English and Spanish. She moved to Colorado to teach and also spent her summers in Mexico to increase her fluency among native speakers. After a few years teaching out west, Kay decided to go to graduate school in her late 20s to get her master's. She was accepted at the University of Maryland. Being on her own out there, Kay had to make do with the only car she could afford. Not happy with the rust spots on the body of her cheap car, she was in the parking lot of the university covering the spots up with wallpaper, thinking that the fun and quirky look was better than the rusted out one. Bob Swartz was walking by and stopped to see what she was doing. She explained it to him, and it was such an unusual thing that he absolutely remembered her when he saw her at the school cafeteria several weeks later. The two started talking, and Bob asked Kay out. They did go out a few times and got to know each other, learning that they had some things in common. For one thing, they were both non-traditional students, even within a master's program. When they met in 1968, Kay was 28, so she was a little bit older than other students. Bob, however, was 36. Both had careers before they entered the program, with Bob having multiple careers, from tracking John Glenn's space flight for NASA to owning laundromats in Wisconsin. And now he was looking for another career change as he got his master's degree in education. Neither Kay nor Bob had dated much as adults, and when they met, that didn't really change right away. They went out a few times, like I said, but nothing seemed to move past the hanging out here and there stage. The biggest block was that Kay didn't want to get into a serious relationship until she finished school. Kay graduated and moved nearby to Washington, D.C. while she figured out what she wanted to do next. She had this English degree, but she wasn't sure she wanted to go back to teaching high school, so she spent the summer exploring her options. She took tests to enlist in the Air Force, but ended up not going through with that. She got a real estate license, but then never worked as a realtor. She also applied for a few jobs out of the country, but when nothing panned out, she ended up picking up substitute teaching jobs to pay the bills, and that led her eventually to going back into teaching full-time. Meanwhile, Bob had dropped out of the graduate program and went to work in the computer field. With both of them done with school and deciding to stay in the area, they started dating more seriously and eventually got engaged. Kay was Catholic, and Bob converted ahead of their June 1970 wedding. But the conversion was not just for the sake of having a church wedding. Bob was a true believer and was eventually more involved in church activities than Kay was. The two settled in Cape St. Clair, Maryland, which is about an hour south of Baltimore. Being that Kay was 30 and Bob was 38, they decided not to waste any time starting a family, but unfortunately, they were not successful in getting pregnant. They consulted a fertility doctor, and he said he didn't believe there were options for them to conceive. Kay had bowel obstruction surgery when she was a child, and the doctor believed that her fallopian tubes had inadvertently been compromised during that surgery. When they learned that, Kay and Bob very quickly started looking into adoption. They came to believe that things had worked out this way for a reason. Bob and Kay had been called to do something different, to adopt older children in need of homes. The couple were well-intentioned. I think we can see a little into their naivety here with the first placement they accepted, which was a sibling group of 4 boys. Fortunately, the social worker could see that this was not setting the family up for success. The couple had only been married for 3 years and had no parenting experience, and the worker didn't want to see these brothers experience more disruption when the placement failed. So she suggested to them another child, a little 6-year-old named Larry. Larry had been born in New Orleans before his parents moved the family to Washington, D.C. The relationship between his parents was abusive, with his mother being young, in her late teens, and his father older. There are accusations and reporting that Larry's birth father was a pimp, though I'm not sure there's legal documentation backing that up. They were not in D.C. for long when his parents split. Larry wasn't even a year old. His mother, Sheila, then had trouble holding down a job because she didn't have a reliable babysitter. Completely overwhelmed and not knowing where to turn, Sheila took Larry to the police station when he was 20 months old. She told them that she had no food at their apartment and the landlord was in the process of evicting her. She wanted to turn Larry over to the state so that he could be cared for and she could work. The police station instead put Sheila in touch with social services so that she could get some type of help, rather than giving her son up, which she seemed unhappy about doing. It's not like she was like, "Here, he's yours." She seemed to want custody, at least initially. She just didn't know how to do that and work at the same time. In addition to helping Sheila apply for ongoing help like food stamps, the social worker approved her for some emergency funds. The day after getting that money, a neighbor heard Larry crying in the apartment, and it didn't sound like anyone was trying to comfort him. So the neighbor went up there and found that he was all alone. The authorities came and took Larry into state care. When Sheila called the police after learning Larry had been taken from the home, she said she had hired a babysitter while she went away overnight, and it was the babysitter who had left Larry alone, not her. Sheila was told to come in and meet with social services to sort things out. She ended up putting off the meeting for 2.5 weeks. She didn't seem to be in a rush to get Larry back. When she finally met with them, she learned that Larry was going to stay in care until Sheila could get things together to take him back. For the next few months, Sheila attended visits with Larry and she met with the social worker regularly. But Sheila was going back and forth over whether she wanted reunification or to sign her rights away. According to the social worker, what it came down to in this young mother's head was a choice between Larry or her new boyfriend. According to the book Set and Fury, Sheila was pregnant with a baby girl when she started dating this boyfriend. He was not interested in raising children who were not his own, so she placed the baby girl for adoption at birth while Larry was still in foster care. She then worried that if she took Larry back, this man would leave her. But on the other hand, she said that she didn't want to give up rights to her son if the relationship with the boyfriend wasn't going to work out long term. Then she would be left without both of her children and without the man she loved. Now, this logic makes my head hurt and my heart hurt to know that Larry was a runner-up to this boyfriend, but I try to remember the position she was in as a young single mother in the 1960s who had no support other than this boyfriend. This is one of those both and situations. She was both making the wrong choice and she was without the resources needed to make the right one. Eventually, this boyfriend proposed, a wedding date was set, and Sheila signed away rights to little Larry. Larry was then bounced between 4 foster homes in the next 4 years, and there have been accusations that at least one of these homes was very abusive. 2 of the placements Larry was put in were supposed to be foster to adopt homes, but both families decided against adoption. It seems the reason was both of the mothers felt they were unable to bond with him. Both of them also told the social worker that Larry would do best in a home as an only child. When Larry was suggested for placement in Bob and Kay's home, the social worker said that it was her opinion that the other parents had favored their biological children over Larry, and that was the main issue in these homes. Larry's behaviors were nothing terribly out of the ordinary for an energetic little boy, so placing him in a home like Kay and Bob's that did not have biological children would be a better option. A weekend visit was set up so that Bob and Kay could meet Larry, and at the end of the weekend, Larry told a social worker that he wanted to stay with them. He did not want to go back to the other foster family at all. So this weekend trial prior to placing Larry in the home turned out to be permanent. Kay and Bob were thrilled as they moved Larry in. There would be a year adjustment period to make sure the placement was working before the adoption would be final. Kay was working as a teacher at this point, but she stayed home with Larry for the first few months to help him adjust to being in a new family. Aside from Larry being behind in school, he was an easy child for them. They reported that they felt well bonded to him, and he seemed eager to please them, particularly Kay, who he attached to well. The social worker seemed to have been right that this was a good fit. During that first year that Larry was with Kay and Bob, things had gone so well that they had already started talking about adopting another child. So just months after Larry's adoption was final, 8-year-old Michael joined the family. Michael was 6 months older than Larry, and he had a pretty similar upbringing. He had lived with his parents until they split up when he was about 3 or 4, and he was put into care when his mother abandoned him and his siblings. Michael bounced from foster home to foster home as the various foster parents would get overwhelmed by his behavioral issues. In all, he was in 6 foster homes before being placed with Bob and Kay. Unlike Larry, Michael's behavior was truly difficult to manage for anyone, even experienced foster parents. Initially, Kay chalked up a lot of his behaviors to just not having been taught properly. Kay told a story about the first week Michael was with them, and Bob snapped at him over some poor table manners. Michael got upset and ran outside crying, and Larry ran after him, put his arms around him, and told him not to worry. It's not such a bad place once you get used to it. Kay told the story with a laugh, like we do when our kids say something precocious, but I think it gives us a little insight into these little boys' world. They were having to get used to homes with different rules, traditions, and personalities every year. And in this case, Bob had yelled at Michael over table manners. So I think that also gives us a hint that maybe he wasn't really equipped to handle a child who had true behavioral issues. But they were determined to make this work and have Michael become their son legally. While Larry's adoption had gone off without a hitch, it was a little harder with Michael since his father's rights had not yet been terminated. And when his birth father tried to get custody through the courts, the Swartzes knew there was a chance he would be taken away. But Michael's only solid memory of his father was from years before when he was around 4 years old, and it wasn't a pleasant one. It involved being abused. After Michael told the judge that he wanted to stay living with the Swartzes, his father's rights were terminated, and he was adopted 2 years after being placed in their home. Michael did prefer living with the Swartz family, where his basic needs were met, and they did family vacations and had family dinners together, and there was a sense of normalcy. But that did not mean this was an easy situation for any of them. Michael had a hard time with self-control and controlling his temper, which eventually led to conflict, as well as a bit of sibling rivalry, as Larry was the favored child with his sweet and mild-mannered personality. And it wasn't just that the boys were perceiving an imbalance on how they were being treated. Family and friends noticed too, and many of them felt sorry for Michael. They didn't always see the more extreme behaviors Michael displayed behind closed doors, so they thought Bob and Kay were being unfairly harsh with him. One uncle tried to show Michael extra attention when they were together at family events, just to try to balance the scales a bit. But I don't want to paint it as though Michael's existence in the Swartz home was all punishment and discipline. Kay tried to find the thing that would inspire him to better himself and work towards something. As soon as Michael showed an interest in music, Kay jumped right on it and signed him up for piano lessons and made sure he practiced, giving him something to be passionate about and focused on. There was one area where Michael did surpass Larry, and that was in school. That was a pretty big deal in the Swartz home, where Kay and Bob were very focused on the boys' education and their grades. While Michael did have some behavioral issues in the classroom at times, academically he was not struggling like Larry was. Larry had a lot of trouble learning to read and write. Even being held back a grade, he was still significantly behind. Kay ended up taking him to be fully evaluated and assessed, and he was given an IQ score of 78. His score was not low enough to be considered intellectually disabled, but it was low enough to show that Larry's struggles weren't a lack of effort or focus. He needed more help with the instructional part of education. So he stayed in a regular classroom most of the day, but he would go to the resource room daily for tutoring and help with his schoolwork. At times it seemed Bob and Kay were understanding of his struggles, but other times they also pushed him academically without maybe fully realizing how it was always going to be something harder for him than the average child. But overall at home, Larry remained the good kid, while Michael was not. And Bob Swartz was known for having a temper, with Michael being the one most often on the receiving end of it. That's not to say that Larry didn't get reprimanded, lectured, yelled at, or spanked. It's just that Larry misbehaved less. One day when Michael got in trouble after a sibling fight with Larry, Kay was reprimanding him when he cursed at her. She slapped him, and then when Bob came home and found out, he lost his temper and also hit Michael multiple times. The reports of what happened in the home generally came from Larry and Michael, but what they said was consistent with each other. Once Bob started hitting Michael, it seemed to become the go-to punishment. And Michael took the brunt of the punishments to the point that even Larry noticed that their parents sided with him more. And even at times when Larry knew he was the one in the wrong. Now that's not to say Larry didn't get hit, it just wasn't as often as it was with Michael. And with an angry child being met with more anger, things escalated from there. Most people on the outside definitely thought Kay and Bob were strict, even overly so, grounding the boys over relatively small infractions and handing out punishments like walking 5 miles to school in bad weather. But it doesn't sound like they were aware of how abusive things had grown, particularly towards Michael. They also didn't see or experience for themselves the more extreme behaviors from Michael that Kay would tell people about. So either one or both sides were exaggerating the severity of what was happening behind closed doors, or one or both sides were just good at keeping up appearances in public. When Michael and Larry were 13, even as family relationships were worsening, Kay and Bob decided to adopt again. This time, a 4-year-old girl we are going to call Amy, as she was a child through everything we're going to talk about. Amy was adopted from South Korea, and though her arrival bumped Larry out of the favored child spot, particularly with Bob, it didn't change how the boys felt about her. Amy ended up being everyone's favorite, Larry and Michael included. As Amy was adjusting to her new life in the U.S. with new family and new language, things between the boys and Bob were beyond strained. Strict parents often struggle with the budding independence of teens, and Michael and Larry both dealt with that in different ways. In Larry's case, he later said he essentially stopped talking to Bob entirely. He would take the lecture and the punishment that was being handed out in silence, only saying, "Are we done? And can I go to my room now?" when Bob started winding down. Michael, on the other hand, would yell back and engage in these verbal altercations with Bob, and he pushed against all of the boundaries hard. And by 7th grade, Michael was in trouble more often than he wasn't. According to Kay, Michael started threatening the family in his tirades. saying things like how he could hide behind a door with a knife and kill Kay and Bob before they could stop him. She was wondering at that point if there was something going on with Michael that he truly could not control, like an underlying mental illness. Then, when his grades were dropping due to lack of effort, they discussed openly in front of Michael about their options with him, which included the possibility of sending him to some type of reform school. For Michael, who had lived in several homes for the first 8 years of his life, being told you might get sent away is a different level of threat than it would be for a child who had a more stable upbringing. I have to imagine that in the late 1970s, Bob and Kay just didn't fully appreciate that. Reactive attachment disorder was not even part of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders until 1980. Michael would not end up being sent to a reform school, but that didn't mean he would stay in the home either. Things came to a head one day when Michael wanted to go out with his friends, and the answer was no. He had been in trouble for his behavior already, so he wasn't really surprised by this. But undeterred, Michael went to his room and snuck out instead. And at this point, we have two versions of the story. According to Michael, after he snuck out, Kay and Bob must have noticed because they locked every window and door so that he could not get back in. When he realized this, he began banging on the door until Kay yelled out that he wasn't allowed back home. So he went to sleep at a friend's house and then went straight to school the next morning, not going home first. But when Kay called Michael's social worker in the morning when he didn't come home, she said that he had run away the night before. Now, Michael denied the accusation that he had run away and insisted Kay told him he could not come back in. When they met with the social worker later that day, Michael said he was presented with two options. He could move to a foster home, or he could go back to Kay and Bob's house while the juvenile system decided how to proceed. Michael wasn't as worried about the system at this point as he was about Bob and what would happen to him if he went back into the house. So he said he wanted to go to the foster home. It was early 1980, and Michael was a couple months away from turning 14. It's not clear how much Larry was made aware of what happened here or if he knew that Michael had chosen foster care. He saw it as Michael being sent away, kicked out of the family. And you can understand why a 13-year-old who had spent ages 2 to 6 being sent away repeatedly would see it that way. Michael was initially placed in a foster home for a few months, but then right around his 14th birthday, he and his friends were arrested for breaking into houses. He was then sent to a boys' home. Back at the Swartz's house, Kay and Bob were dedicated to making sure Larry didn't go down the same path Michael did. And without Michael's worse behaviors to occupy their time, even Larry's smallest infractions were noticed. He was well-liked and popular at school, but he still struggled to keep his grades up and keep his parents happy. And hanging over him was this idea that he too could be sent away. Maybe in a sincere show of faith, or maybe in an attempt to get his parents' approval back, Larry told them he was considering becoming a priest. Bob and Kay were thrilled. Bob had become even more devout over the years, participating both in church events and abortion protests, and the idea of having a priest as a son really pleased him. In 1981, Larry was headed to high school, and Kay and Bob found a seminary high school 8 hours away near Erie, Pennsylvania. So rather than start school locally with his friends, he was sent to this boarding school. The school was academically rigorous, and it was definitely not the right place for Larry. Larry's learning disabilities affected his language skills the most, and this school required 4 years of Latin. He didn't even pass the first year, and he barely passed his other classes. After he wrapped up his freshman year, the school sent his report card with a letter saying he would not be invited back for his 10th grade year. While a lot of parents would have contacted the school to try to figure out options, Kay and Bob just dropped it and enrolled Larry in the public high school where Kay taught for his sophomore year. It's possible they realized he needed the special education services that the public school provided, or they didn't push it because Larry didn't want to go back. The idea of becoming a priest wasn't a serious one for him, and it may have just been an attempt, like I said, to please his parents. And while Larry was at the school, he had done what a lot of 13 and 14-year-olds do. He hit puberty, and this idea of never being in a romantic relationship made him realize the priesthood wasn't for him. When Larry came back home from boarding school, Michael was still not back. He was in state custody, with Bob and Kay paying child support to the state towards his care. They did not want to give up on their son or close the door on him completely. So in April of 1982, at a hearing, it was determined that Michael would come home if he stayed out of trouble for a year. That was what Kay and Bob agreed to, but their views changed over the next several months. Phone calls with Michael didn't always go well, and after he screamed at Kay one day, calling her all sorts of names, Bob told him they were not going to take his calls for a while. Michael always called collect, and he kept trying to talk to them, but they wouldn't accept the charges. But if Larry picked up the phone, he would talk to Michael, so there was some contact between the two brothers at this time. By August of 1982, Bob and Kay had decided Michael was not going to come home at all. They changed their wills to explicitly disinherit him, saying that everything would be given to Larry and Amy and that Michael was not to inherit at all. And then they told the court that Michael should not come home at the next 6-month hearing, which came up in October. The focus of Michael's care turned from reunification to finding a path to a successful adult life. He would be in a group home most of the time, with a foster home he could go to for weekends and holidays, until he could then transition to independent living. He was at this point 16 years old. Bob and Kay continued to double down on their efforts to keep Larry from getting into the same trouble Michael did. Kay's demeanor seemed to change over this time period, having gone from being the gentler parent who would sometimes calm Bob down to being more strict and less affectionate. According to both Larry and Kay's students at the high school, you never really knew which Kay you were going to get some days. She could be funny and sweet one day and then angry and biting with her sarcasm the next. It makes me wonder about what she was really going through emotionally having Michael back in the foster care system. It makes me think like she didn't just wash her hands of him without a worry. I imagine this entire thing broke something in her that she was having trouble putting back together. Whether it was confidence in her parenting abilities, her view of what type of person she was, or what, I don't know. Larry noticed the change mainly because the fallout was largely aimed at him. After deciding Michael wasn't coming home, they put Larry under almost a permanent grounding. Rather than being told he was grounded for a weekend or a week, they just said no to pretty much everything he wanted to do. Anytime he asked to go somewhere, the answer was no. He went to school and he went to soccer practice, but that was about it. On the rare occasions where he was allowed to hang out with friends, it would only be friends that Bob and Kay had approved of, though even that didn't always go smoothly. One night, Larry was at a friend's house with a group of teens, and they were invited to spend the night and watch a movie. Larry called home to see if he was allowed to stay, and Kay asked what movie they planned to watch. When Larry said it was Superman 2, Kay said absolutely not. The friend's mother, Susan, got on the phone with Kay to figure out what the issue was, and Kay said that she heard the movie had a scene where Superman was in bed with Lois Lane. This was not an explicit sex scene, but the implication they had sex was enough for Kay to say no. Now, mind you, Larry was 16 at this point. Kay didn't stop with her disdain for the implied sex scene, but then went on about how casual attitudes around sex cause all sorts of societal ills, the worst of which for Kay and Bob was abortion, which Bob protested against every Saturday morning. Now, Susan eventually convinced Kay to allow Larry to stay the night, but only if they picked a different movie to watch. Eventually, that school year ended, and Larry hadn't done well in his classes, but definitely better than his first year at the boarding school. And with that, Larry was given more freedom since he didn't have schoolwork to do or tests to study for. He was eager to get his license, but his parents always found a reason to put off driving lessons. When school started again in the fall, Larry was not put back on the same restriction he was the year before, and as long as he kept his grades in the C range, he was more or less allowed to go out with friends. A major issue continued to be his Spanish grade. Again, with a learning disability that affected his language learning, there was very little Larry could do to get this grade any higher. So Larry was pretty stressed in January of 1984 when mid-year exams were going on, because passing them was a big indicator of how pleasant the rest of the school year was. If he did well, he would still get to have some of this freedom his parents had given him, but if he didn't do well, he would be stuck at home more and more. One reason he wanted to be able to go out was that Larry had a girlfriend. Now, Kay didn't approve of her. According to Larry, he called her a slut, but Kay didn't approve of dating at all. She was mostly okay if Larry went on dates with girls as long as they were double dates or group dates, but she didn't want him to take out the same girl more than once. She disapproved of any type of actual relationship at his age. And again, this came down to sex. Larry was less likely to have premarital sex if he never had a real girlfriend. But he did have a girlfriend, and Kay was not pleased about it, so we can add that to the list of tensions in the home. As for Michael at this point, he was in a psychiatric hospital. He was just 2 months away from turning 18. And I never quote directly from books, but I do want to read this section of Sudden Fury verbatim, just because it really captures Michael's situation, and frankly, it's good writing. Quote, "While social workers waited for Michael to turn 18, they could do little more than find him spare beds in group homes and juvenile shelters. It was a waiting game, really, for Michael had tried out every cubbyhole that the Maryland child care system had to offer, and he had outgrown them all. The only place left for him to go was out." End quote. In December of 1983, Michael had found himself in his third placement in just as many months, and no option to go home to his family. This placement lasted less than 24 hours, and it wasn't a foster home or even a group home. This was a youth homeless shelter. According to one of the counselors there, Michael pulled a knife on her and waved it in her direction. Michael later claimed he was simply emptying his pockets since there was a sign that said no weapons, and he denied he waved it at her at all. He was then admitted to Crownsville Hospital on the psychiatric unit, though it's not clear if they really thought he needed inpatient help or they were just out of places to send him. As Leslie Walker wrote, the only place left for him to go was out. Larry and Michael had been in touch by phone during this time, but it's not clear if Larry told their parents that they were in contact. Even if he did, he certainly didn't tell them the content of these conversations. I don't think it's any surprise to anyone out there that siblings spend a significant amount of time complaining about their parents to each other. Who else shares that experience? And on that front, Larry and Michael had a lot to talk about. Michael finally asked Larry why he didn't just leave if it was so bad, and Larry said he was worried about leaving Amy behind. After all, they had been harder on Larry after Michael left. So what would they do to Amy, who was just 9 or 10 years old? And I say 9 or 10 because Amy's age is inconsistently reported, and part of that is explained in the book Sudden Fury. Apparently, her birth date when she was adopted was given as October 1973, but believing due to her size that she was younger than that, Bob and Kay started reporting her birthday as October 1974. So if that's accurate, Amy was 10, but she would have thought she was 9. On Monday, January 16th, 1984, Larry and Amy both went to school as usual. Due to these mid-year exams, Larry did get out a little early, and he hung out with a friend until he headed home for dinner and to study for the rest of the week's tests. The next morning, January 17th, around 7:15 a.m., Larry called 911. He told the dispatcher that he thought his parents were dead. When he was asked what was wrong with them, he said he didn't know. He just saw them lying, quote, down there, and that his mother was on the ground outside. Larry was reportedly so composed and matter-of-fact on this 911 call that they first thought it was probably a prank. But of course, they sent first responders out to the scene anyway. Due to the snow and ice on the roads, they did have to go a little slower than usual, but they got there pretty quickly. When they arrived, Larry and Amy were holding hands at the kitchen door, and Larry directed the paramedics downstairs. Down in a small office in the finished basement, they found 51-year-old Bob Swartz lying on the floor and covered in blood. It appeared he had been at the desk working on his computer, a Commodore 64, when the attacker entered the room. Things in the room were knocked over, indicating a struggle had taken place. Outside the basement, through a sliding glass door, they found 43-year-old Kay Swartz's body in the snow. She was nude except for one sock, which made them wonder if she had been sexually assaulted. She had been dragged to the position she was in, with there being a larger pool of blood about 12 feet from her body. Her clothing, which was a zip-up flannel nightdress, was near her body. It wasn't clear if it had been taken off of her or if it had possibly come off when she was dragged. Due to the amount of blood at the scene, the police thought at first the two had been shot. They even did gunshot residue tests on Larry, who was the only other nearly adult in the house. But on autopsy, it was determined that Bob had been stabbed 17 times from his chin to his abdomen, and he had defensive wounds on his arm, with some of the stab wounds being consistent with Bob moving around during the attack. The knife would have been a pretty strong one, according to the medical examiner, so something more like a hunting knife rather than like a steak knife. Kay had also been stabbed 7 times, though 5 of these wounds were shallow. She had no defensive wounds, and the fatal wound was not a stab wound at all. She had been hit on the head with a heavy, blunt object. In the basement area, the investigators found dried blood on doorknobs and a bloody palm print on the sliding glass door. There was also blood in the little sitting area where the TV was, and because Kay was found outside, they initially thought that might be Bob's blood. So a theory emerged that Kay had been attacked while outside in the yard. Bob got up from his computer to head to the backyard to see what was going on, and the attacker met him in the TV room and struck. Backing into his computer room, where there were clearly signs of a struggle, the two fought until Bob was overpowered and killed. The killer, now with blood on his hands, left the basement, leaving behind the blood smears on the door. Now, thankfully, the palm print was clear enough to lift and get some points of comparison should they find a suspect to compare it with. This theory seemed to fit the evidence they initially had, but then a wrench was thrown in it when they got a call from a neighbor down the block. He called after he heard about the murders because he found blood in the snow in his front yard. The police went to check on it, thinking maybe it would give a clue as to which way the killer went. They noticed there were footprints in the snow and additional blood along the trail. They followed it 3/4 of a mile through the woods behind the Swartz's house until it led them right back to the house. I assumed when I read this that the killer was walking around in the snow, but the police noticed something else. There were what looked like 2 sets of footprints along this path, and in at least one spot, one of the prints had no tread or sign of a bare foot. They believed it was someone who was walking, running, or fleeing with just one sock on, like how Kay had been found. So this led to a new theory. The blood in the TV sitting room was actually Kay's, and she was attacked and injured while watching TV. To save herself, she fled the home. The killer chased after her, and when he caught up to her, he forced her back into the family's backyard, where he killed her, hitting her with the splitting maul, which was found in the woods behind the house, and then he stabbed her. As for when Bob was killed in all of this, perhaps that's what gave Kay the time to escape. The killer first attacked Kay in the sitting room. Either he believed she was incapacitated at this point, or Bob was coming to see what was going on and was the bigger threat. This killer then attacked Bob. Kay was able to come to enough to leave the house looking for help until the killer caught up to her. Robbery was quickly ruled out as a motive, as Bob's wallet with $150 in cash in it was in his pocket, and it didn't appear that anything else in the house had been touched. The investigators hoped to get some information from the 2 surviving people in the home that night, which were Larry and Amy Swartz, and they were talked to multiple times, even on that first day. Initially, they had sat Larry and Amy down together to interview them almost as soon as investigators had arrived at the scene, but Amy got too upset as they were discussing things and needed to take a break. So over the course of that day, they talked to them both together and separately, but I'm going to combine their initial statements into one for each of them just to make it easier to understand. In Amy's version of events, she said that she had been woken up the night before by a scream at 11:34 p.m. She knew the precise time because she had looked at her watch. She got out of bed to figure out what was going on and went out to the carport. That's when she saw who she thought was her father lying in the snow. We know it was actually Kay, but it was dark, and she had just woken up, so she seemed to have been confused. She said she also saw a man carrying a shovel walking away from the house, and she could see that there was blood on the shovel. The investigators wondered if what she thought was a shovel was actually the wood-splitting maul. Amy was asked to describe the man she saw, and she said he had black hair that was a little curly on top and hung down to his shoulders. He was wearing a gray sweatshirt that said Broad Neck on the back. Now, Broad Neck was the high school where Kay worked and Larry went to school. So, to put you in the detective's shoes a bit, imagine a child had just described the killer like this, while sitting right next to her was her brother, who had black hair that was curly on the top and nearly reached his shoulders. And the killer was wearing a sweatshirt with the name of Larry's school on it. So they were wondering about Larry at this point when they asked Amy how tall the killer was. They used a 6-foot-tall investigator as a reference point, and Amy said the man she saw was taller than the detective. Now, Larry was only 5'9", but he offered up that their brother Michael, who also had dark hair, was 6'4". Then they asked Amy if the man was as tall as Michael, and she said yes, the man looked like her brother. Larry quickly clarified, "You mean Michael?" and she agreed. By this point, Larry had already told the police that Michael was in a psychiatric facility, so they said something about Michael being unable to leave a secure facility like that, and Larry said he had done it before. He even came to the neighborhood in recent weeks for a visit. As for what happened after seeing this man walk away, Amy said Larry was in the kitchen and called her inside. She told him that she heard a scream and that their dad was hurt, and he told her that she was dreaming and it was time to go back to bed. Now, as for Larry's version of events, he said he got home around 5 the day before after having hung out with his friends after school. The family had dinner around 7, and then he went back up to his room. The police asked him if there were any arguments that night, and he said Bob was mad at him. Larry had shown some friends Bob's new computer, and they had messed around with a disk, and now it wasn't working. But he said it wasn't really that big of a deal, and he went to bed around 9 p.m. after having put his laundry in the washer. The police did find wet clothes in the washer consistent with Larry's size, and before you ask, no, there was no gray sweatshirt with the word Broadneck on the back, but there were other school spirit type shirts in there. Larry said when he went to bed, his mom was watching TV and his dad was working on the computer. At some point in the overnight hours, Larry said Amy had woken up. He saw her just outside the kitchen door on the porch and told her to come back in. She told him she had heard screams, but he hadn't heard anything and thought she was just having a nightmare. She would occasionally wake up from vivid dreams, and he'd let her sleep in the beanbag chair in his room, which is what he did this night as well. Larry also said he heard the dogs barking, but it didn't really alarm him because these dogs were just barkers. It was around 7 a.m. that Amy woke Larry up and told him that she couldn't find their parents. It was a school morning and no one was around to help her get ready. He left his room and went out to the dining room area, and he looked out the window to check on the dogs and to call them in, which is when he said he saw Kay's body out in the snow. He said his first instinct was to keep Amy from seeing that, so he grabbed her, got her out of the room, and then he called 911. During the various times they questioned Larry this day, they noticed that he had been inconsistent on what he exactly did and saw. For instance, one time he said he was looking out the dining room window when he saw Kay. The next time he said it was the kitchen window, and then in another statement he went back to it being the dining room window. Another thing that alarmed them from the jump was how composed Larry was. They actually had a paramedic assess him for shock to see if he needed to go to the hospital because he was so emotionless. However, he showed no physical signs of shock like rapid heartbeat or shallow breathing. It really was just his demeanor. The investigators also noticed that Larry had an injury to the back of his hand, which he said was a burn from cooking. A big issue, however, with Larry as a suspect was Amy's statement that made it impossible for Larry to have done this, or at least not alone. She said she looked out and saw what she thought was her father's body, and then she saw a man walking away. And then, as the man was walking away, or right after, Larry was in the house, behind her, calling her back inside. If Amy was remembering this correctly, Larry could not have been that man. And so that led the police to Michael. Larry definitely gave the impression that he thought Michael had done it. He made multiple comments that pointed directly at Michael, and so did others. Michael had threatened his parents' life before. He had history of pulling a knife on someone, allegedly, and his description was consistent with who Amy saw. So the investigators followed up on Michael, who was at the hospital when they went to talk to him. They didn't tell him his parents had been murdered. Instead, they told him they were there about a stolen motorcycle. Without knowing the real reason they were there, anything Michael said about the actual crime, about the murders, would be very suspicious. But Michael didn't give away anything. He said he had been in his room in the hospital all night, and the nurses said there was no way he could have left. Not only did they check on him during the night, the unit was secure in both directions. Even if he managed to get through security and slip out, he would have also needed to get through security to get back in, and it seemed improbable on a good day. If Michael was in a group home or a regular foster home, I think he would have been at the top of the suspect list. But even if he couldn't have been the one who actually committed the crime, the police did wonder if he knew something about it. But they didn't get a lot of chances to question him because Michael ended up getting an attorney when he thought he was a suspect in a motorcycle theft. There was evidence that made them look more at Larry than anyone else. For one thing, they found shoes in the house that had blood on the soles, like someone had walked through the crime scene. They showed the shoes to Amy, who identified them as Larry's. The thing is, Larry denied he went downstairs at all. So how did the blood get on the bottom of his shoes? That wasn't the only thing Larry seemed to not have mentioned to police. Amy told the investigators that she told Larry she saw their father's body and he told her she was dreaming. Larry said she only told him that she heard screams. Also, Amy mentioned Larry was vomiting that night after she had gone to sleep in his room, and Larry left that part out of his statement entirely. Now, when Larry was asked about these last two things in particular, he admitted to something that would explain not remembering exactly what Amy said and the throwing up. He didn't volunteer the information initially, but now that he was confronted with it, he confessed that he had stolen a bottle of rum from a neighbor's house. He drank so much of it that night that he was drunk, and unfortunately, that made his exact memories fuzzy. The police ended up keeping Larry and Amy at the station until 9:30 at night on that first day of the investigation. They then left to spend the night with family friends, and investigators sat down to look over what they had. By this point, they had already all but ruled Michael out, in spite of Larry bringing his name up repeatedly as someone with a motive to kill Bob and Kay. There was just no way he could have left the secure unit overnight without someone noticing. Larry seemed to be their strongest suspect, except that Amy said he called her inside while this man was walking away, and that was a big issue in the timeline. But Amy also had other details wrong, like how she thought it was her father in the snow and not her mother. So was she possibly misremembering this? Maybe the order of events was fuzzy, or the time span between them. Did Larry have enough time to leave the yard and circle back to come inside while Amy was standing there, sleepy and disoriented? The investigators decided that night that they needed to go back and start at the very beginning by listening to the recording of Larry's 911 call again. And they immediately noticed something that you may have noticed yourself. Larry told the 911 dispatcher that he thought his parents were dead. However, when he was asked by police, Larry repeatedly said he never went downstairs. He never saw Bob's body. So why did he tell the dispatcher that his parents were dead and not just his mother was dead? And he didn't know where his father was. Larry knew his father was dead without seeing the body, and that alone implicated him in the crime. And that wouldn't be the only thing that implicated him. Of course, blood on his shoes was another thing. And then the next day, the investigators decided to spend a little more time in the house, which is when they realized that whether from the dining room window or the kitchen window, Larry could not have seen Kay's body. The positioning of everything didn't work. The family friends who had taken Larry and Amy in knew Larry was a suspect, so they connected him with an attorney who then brought in a more experienced criminal defense attorney to help. As soon as these two were on board, there would be no more questioning Larry and no more complying. Especially when the police asked to take Larry's prints to compare them to the bloody palm print on the downstairs patio door. So the state took it to a judge to get a warrant, and 3 days after Bob and Kay's funeral, the judge issued the order. Larry was going to have to go to the station and have his prints taken. Larry's attorneys knew the evidence against their client was strong. Not only did his shoes have blood on them, the police had since matched the treads to the shoe prints in the snow around Kay's body. He was at the scene, and his story was inconsistent every time he told it. If that palm print came back a match, that was it. He would be arrested and almost certainly convicted. So the lawyers met with Larry behind closed doors after the order from the judge was issued. They told him that the police did not believe his story and that the case against him was strong. A lot of attorneys will tell their clients, if you're guilty, don't tell me that. But the strategy here was different. They believed their client was guilty, and they were considering an insanity defense based on Larry's background with abuse in the foster care system. But Larry would have to admit to what he did first, and preferably before the fingerprints came back a match. Developing an insanity defense after the arrest was made looks more calculated. It's best to get it on the record as early as possible. With assurances from his attorneys that they would be there for him no matter what he did, Larry broke down sobbing and started saying over and over again, "I did it, I did it. He wouldn't stop hitting me." Larry was so inconsolable that he barely said anything else for a good half an hour. Larry would go on to give his attorneys a full confession, at least as much as he could remember. He said that after dinner, Bob went downstairs to work on the computer as he was teaching himself how to program it. Kay changed into her blue flannel sleeper before heading downstairs to watch TV. It was just 10 or 15 minutes after they went downstairs that Bob started yelling. Larry could hear him from up in his room, and then he heard Kay tell Bob to go ask Larry because she didn't know anything about it. Larry was hesitant to come out of his room because Bob was furious, but he really had no other choice. Bob said something was messed up on his computer, and Larry admitted that he and his friends had been down there and maybe they had done something. Bob just kept yelling at him. Larry yelled back a little bit, and then Bob stormed off to his office. Larry went back into his room, and he was very angry. He said he was just thinking about everything that had happened over the last 3 or 4 years. Michael being ejected from the family, threats to kick Larry out too, feeling his parents didn't love him anymore, promises that had been made and broken, and of course, all the screaming, yelling, and hitting that he had been put through. So he was sitting in his room, drinking rum mixed with juice that he had taken from the kitchen. Larry eventually went downstairs again to put his laundry in the wash while Kay was watching TV, and just like Amy had reported, it was around 11:30. Kay asked Larry how he had done on his tests that day, and he was honest, saying that he may have failed one of them, but he felt he had done well on the other. Kay, according to Larry, said sarcastically that knowing him, he failed them both. So Larry was already worked up from the incident with Bob and sitting stewing in his room. The alcohol did not help. And this sarcastic comment from Kay, from Larry's point of view, pushed him over the edge. He said he picked up the splitting maul from nearby and hit Kay from behind. Bob heard a commotion and came into the room, which is when Larry attacked him with the kitchen knife. Kay tried to get away, and that's when Larry stabbed her to death and dragged her body outside. He stripped her naked, and to degrade her even a little more, he said he fingered her. According to Larry, there was no chase through the neighborhood. Any blood evidence or footprints circling around were just from him getting rid of evidence in the woods. Amy must have seen him walking away at some point as he was getting rid of stuff, but in the fuzziness of sleep, she thought he called her back inside right after that when time must have passed. Larry himself wasn't entirely sure because his memories from the night were not clear, and what he did remember didn't always match the evidence. For instance, there was blood in the sitting room area, so it looked like Kay had been hit while watching TV. But there was much more blood outside in the snow, and it seemed more likely that Kay was primarily attacked outside as she tried to flee. Larry also had big gaps in the order of things, and his attorneys felt that this distorted memory was a sign that he was not sane at the time of the killings. After his confession, Larry's defense team contacted the prosecutor and said something was happening and they would be in contact in a few days. They didn't want to let them know that Larry confessed, but they also wanted to establish that they were working on things before an arrest was made, so it didn't look like the insanity defense was a Hail Mary after. The attorneys then took Larry to the police station to have his prints taken as ordered by the judge, and then they drove him immediately to a psychiatrist for assessment. 30 minutes later, while Larry was at the psychiatrist's office, his attorney got the call. The bloody handprint was a match to Larry, and they were getting arrest warrants for both murders. On January 25th, at the age of 17, Larry Swartz was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He then surrendered himself voluntarily to the police. When he did not enter a plea, a not guilty plea was entered on his behalf. Over the next several months, Larry was evaluated by experts. His adoption records were subpoenaed, which gave us the details about his life before his adoption, and hospital records from after his adoption were sought. The hospital records were pulled after a tip was called in about physical abuse, but nothing in Larry's medical records indicated anything beyond the usual injuries a high school soccer player would have. The adoption records, however, laid the foundation for why Larry would have overall mental health issues that were untreated because, according to his attorney, Bob and Kay were well-intentioned but ill-equipped to raise children in need of that level of extra support. So the defense was going to argue insanity on 2 fronts. One was that Larry was mentally ill, and the other was that he was triggered that night into a brief psychosis. This was going to be disputed by the state. Their 5 experts who evaluated Larry found that he was sane at the time of the murders, and though he had a mixed personality disorder and deep-seated anger towards his parents, he was not psychotic. 4 of the 5 defense experts said he did show signs of psychosis during the murders, and one said that he also had schizophrenia. The lines between the 2 sides were pretty well established when the trial was about to start, the state saying he was sane and the defense saying he wasn't. And one thing that I really liked about the book, Sudden Fury, was that the author had interviewed the attorneys involved, so you really get the behind the scenes of what the prosecutor was thinking building his case and what the defense was thinking as they tried to build their defense. And it's really a fascinating behind-the-scenes look, so I definitely recommend the book if you're interested in the legal side. And it was really helpful to get this behind-the-scenes look because we ended up not seeing either case presented at trial. The day before jury selection in April of 1985, the state and the defense struck an 11th-hour plea deal. Larry pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder. The judge then sentenced him to 20 years to be served concurrently, and then suspended 8 of those years on each count. So what this means is Larry was to spend 12 years in prison at a facility geared towards mental health treatment. This seemed to be the compromise everyone wanted, where Larry accepted guilt for the crimes, and he would get the help he needed. The judge called the murders one of the most tragic events the county had ever experienced, and he expressed compassion towards Larry. All of the evaluations on both sides, whether insane at the time of the crime or not, showed that Larry was in deep need of help. Now, as for what happened after the court case was resolved, Amy's custody was in dispute. She was staying with the family friends who took her and Larry home that first night, and they wanted to pursue adoption. But there were family members who were named in Bob and Kay's will as the guardians, and they had some concerns about how well Amy's needs could be met, as this family had several other children. Eventually, the family members dropped their own petition for custody, likely for the sake of stability for Amy, and then she was legally adopted again. Obviously, Larry went to prison, and then in 1990, so did Michael. Then 24, Michael had been with a friend when they tried to rob a 57-year-old man named Robert Bell. The loot they were seeking was literally a jar of quarters. Their plan was that one person would sneak the jar out while Robert was being distracted by conversation. But according to Michael, he was talking to Robert when something went wrong, and his friend Ronald Scotes suddenly started stabbing Robert. Michael then, to some degree, joined in. Michael was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. According to the Maryland inmate locator, he remains in custody. While Larry was in prison, he completed his high school education and 2 years of college before being paroled in 1993. When he was paroled, he went to live with a family he met while he was in prison. The parents in this family had read the book Sudden Fury, and they felt bad for Larry. They began writing to him, which eventually led to visits. So when Larry was released from prison at the age of 27, it seemed to make sense for him to move in with them and their 2 daughters. They ended up legally adopting him. Eventually, Larry and these new parental figures got into arguments, largely about control. Larry was a grown man, not a child, and it seemed like there were some odd dynamics in that house, which is also part of why I'm just not going to name this family. They seem to have been another possibly well-intentioned but ill-equipped family. Larry ended up getting married and had a baby before he divorced his first wife. He remarried, and then in 2005, at the age of 38, Larry died suddenly from a heart attack. Much of the media reporting around Larry, from after his arrest, during the trial, after the release of Sudden Fury, and then again at the time of his death, largely reflected the judge's compassion for him in giving him a relatively light sentence for a double homicide. And this did bother some of the family members of Bob and Kay, and one publicly took issue with the reporting around the case, painting the victims as perpetrators and the perpetrator as a victim. And I think that's the issue with this case. It's the part that makes us uncomfortable. Bob and Kay were not, according to Larry's lawyer, bad people, but he followed that up by saying that it didn't mean that they were good parents. Larry was a child who needed more than well-intentioned parents. He needed actual help. He needed consistency and boundaries and expectations, but without the abuse. That said, he was also a murderer, brutally killed his 2 parents, and then tried to get away with it by blaming his even more severely abused brother, who had already been scapegoated by the family for years. So were Bob, Kay, and Larry the perpetrators or the victims? Were they good or were they bad? Or were they, as Josh Hallmark wisely says, both and? Thank you for listening. You can find Crime Lines on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and occasionally TikTok. Crime Lines is on Patreon, where I offer early and ad-free episodes as well as bonus content. Visit patreon.com/crimelines. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crime Lines, you can give a one-time donation at basementfortproductions.com/support. And if you need a palate cleanser after listening to heavier true crime shows, check out Rusty Hinges, an allegedly funny history, mystery, and true crime show that I co-created and write for.